it. So I am curious, has anyone heard it? No, I have a captive, okay, only two of you. So I have a captive audience of people who've never heard my story. I love it. So like Susan, I was young when I had my near-death experience. I'm in my 50s now, and I was a senior in college, and I was agnostic. So I was raised in one of those evangelical abusive homes where I looked around at my family and I thought, I am not going to be like these people. And so I threw all religion out, and I also grew up very poor. So I was going to college to become a lawyer. That was where my skill set was. I could talk my way in and out of things. But what happened is once I got to college, all the pain of abuse. My mom was physically and emotionally abusive. My dad pretty much neglected me. An uncle was a child molester, and he was also very evangelical and very adamant and controlling women. So I just came out as this feminist, and I was just raging for worldly success. And yet I got to college and I just felt like depressed, and all this horror of what had happened to me really kind of hit me. And so long story short, I went to see a psychologist, and she was like, well, what do you like doing? And I was like, well, I liked running. And so my senior year, I was on my way to run Austin 10K, and this is a big race in Austin, Texas. And it was this symbol of getting my life together. I was going to enter law school, and on the way to this race, I had a head-on collision. And
Mm.
what really struck me about this was the first light was yellow, and I know I gunned it because I was late for the race. The next light was red, but he must have gunned it too because we hit each other at about 60 miles an hour, both of us, and it was intense. I was in a little Honda Civic, and my car just crunched up. He was in a big SUV. And, physically it was horrible because I had been training for this race and I was in great shape. And suddenly my entire body was just slumped over to the side and I couldn't get up. And I noticed that my knee was bleeding and my foot was bleeding. And I felt just very hot and tired. And I remember thinking, oh dear, someone's going to have to stop and help us. Well, now they have those laws, the Good Samaritan laws, where people have to stop. This is a Sunday morning. I watched three people go by, and I thought about the Good Samaritan, and I was like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, is anyone going to stop and help us? Well, eventually a nurse stopped, and her boyfriend got out, ran across the street to call for the ambulance, and she stayed with me. And she was like, honey, don't move. You're in really bad shape. They're going to put you on a board. They're going to take you to the hospital. I had a very long wait in the hospital because, I was a college student. I didn't think to get health insurance. I waited 17 hours before anyone operated on me. I had, CAT scans and MRIs, and, everything had been done. But I overheard, this was a Sunday, and I overheard the nurses talking behind me. And one of the nurses said, he's on the golf course. He's not going to come in because she doesn't have health insurance. I lost it.
Wow.
I was, I was a strong person, but I broke at that point, and I was calling him every name in the book. And my family started exiting, and I was left alone in this waiting room, and my anger turned to tears, and eventually it just turned to self-pity. Well, you know how God works. In really bizarre ways. The head of surgery, this young woman who had been doing amazing things with spinal surgery, walked past me and looked at my chart. And I looked at her and I said, look, I'm going to kill myself if I can't walk. I am not going to make it. If you don't operate on me, if you don't help me, I'm out of here. And she looked at me, and this kind of caught her attention, and she said, I think I can help you, but I've been on duty for 40 hours, so I have to go home. I have to rest. I have to eat dinner, and then I'm going to come back and operate on you. Now, during this time, I'd had no painkillers because they didn't know what kind of internal injuries I had. So there I am, strapped to a board, waiting for her to go home and eat dinner. But I was happy, because someone was going to operate on me. Well, as soon as she came back, they put me under. And I remember counting backwards, and I signed, like before I counted backwards, I signed a piece of paper that said 17% chance of death. And I thought, well, that's kind of high for a 21-year-old, that I wouldn't expect it to be that high. But what can I do? Oh, I need the surgery. So, I went in. The next thing I realized, I was outside of my body looking down on myself in surgery. And I knew immediately that this was not a dream. Like, all my agnostic beliefs went out the door the minute I saw my body on that operating table. I saw from like the top of my back all the way down my back and my hip completely opened, all this blood, on the sheets, and my hands were kind of like this. I also saw these amazing light beings, these angels that were behind my surgeons, and they comforted my soul immediately. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, do these brilliant neurosurgeons know that angels are working through them? How could they possibly know? This is glorious to believe. And as they were working on me, I was just watching, and the angels were assuring me that they would take care of this, that they were working through the surgeons, that they would help them find the pieces of bone fragment that were pressing on my spine, because I had lost feeling in one of my legs before going into surgery. And as the surgeons were working, the angels said, watch this. And as they did this, my whole body lit up with light and healing, and I knew I'd be fine. I knew that the body would be fine. But the monitor stopped at that time. And then I'd heard so many, movies where the monitor flatlines. I was like, oh, so I was out of body. Now I'm technically dead. This is death. And I remember almost laughing because the angels had already told me, how the soul moves and how it expands in the afterlife. And the first thing that I remember thinking is I felt so much smarter outside of the body. And I considered myself a pretty good student. I didn't have to study that hard. I got into a state school. I had a fair amount of intelligence. But in the afterlife, I mean, like, all of this information was just downloaded and given to me. And I remember thinking, wow, this is amazing. I don't have the brain filtering consciousness. I can just understand things that I've never understood before. And so I flew through the hospital uh, like corridor. And in the corridor, I saw my stepdad. And this is a verifiable detail. A lot of INS researchers love this because it shows that when you're outside of body, you see something. I saw him get a candy bar out of the vending machine, and he was vegan and a health nut, and this, it had milk in it and lots of sugar. And it was just kind of funny to see that he was eating a candy bar. And I remember thinking, oh, if I don't come back, I hope he's good to my mom. That wasn't the importance of that moment to me, but researchers love that. Later, I verified with my mom and dad that he came back into the waiting room with this candy bar and interrupted them. They were on their knees praying at that moment. They felt like I had died. And to me, that means more, because I think parents are connected to their children and they feel that moment when they leave their body. But as I left my stepdad, I went into the night sky, and I just began to feel this oneness with everyone I had ever known. And I just felt great love for everyone, even people who had just handed me a coffee or a bagel. Suddenly my soul was like, I love you. I hope you have a great life. If I don't come back, just enjoy it. I just felt so much freedom in that space and not a bit of fear. People always think death is fearful, but it was like becoming a bird with this great consciousness. And I was like, awesome. Here I am flying around, seeing things in a new way. The next thing I knew, I transitioned into, some near death experiencers have a tunnel. I didn't really go through a tunnel. It was just this moment. And then I was in space. And the stars were all around me, and it was beautiful. And I felt this incredible love coming towards me. Love and intelligence is what it felt like. And I was hearing certain things like love is all that matters. It's all that you take with you when you go. Remind them to go to nature and also be like a little child. These messages were very simple. And, at certain moments during my near death experience, I kind of questioned that. And that was one of them. I was like, I'm going to need a little something more than this. This is all good, but I need something more. And in that moment, I saw my life, and it was a quick life review. But what I saw that I needed to do better was I was judgmental of some people, and it really hit my core. There were some people I worked with at a restaurant called Tres Amigos, and they were a little bit older than me. I was a college student, and they were a married couple, and they were kind of career waiters. And I remember thinking they weren't cool enough to talk to me, and I didn't give them any time of day. And they actually went home and prayed for me. They thought I was depressed, and I saw their hearts and how beautiful they were. And on the other side, I just felt like such a heal. I just felt like, oh, these are really sweet, wonderful people who actually cared about me. And I was superficial and silly. And it wasn't like I was being judged. It was just like my soul was like, you can do better. You can do better than that. And so from that moment, I was like, oh, I can't wait to go back and know people and like people and get to know people for who they are and who they are at a heart level, because that's what matters is the heart. God sees the heart. I want to see the heart. And as I started seeing other moments in my life, I saw beautiful moments where I meditated as a kid. I didn't even realize that I did that, but I would go into a briar patch and I would play with God. I grew up in the country, and I said, hey, God, if you're there, I want to see some rabbits. And so these rabbits like came out of the briar and were playing around me. And I saw certain moments of just being joyful and happy as a kid. And I saw that that's good. We're meant to enjoy life. We're meant to be joyful and to enjoy our lives no matter what is going on, that we don't take the pain and the abuse with us. We take the joy. Well, as I finished that life review, I transitioned into this, what I call a holding place, but some people might call heaven. And it was gorgeous. The grass looked like it had never met death before. It was emerald green and swaying almost with music. It was unusual. Like all I could think is there is no death. This is immortality. This is where all things that have died are made new again. And when I thought that, I saw my grandfather. And he was not the man in his 70s who died of leukemia who had waved to me. The last person he saw was me. And he waved, and then he died when we came back from lunch. I saw him, and he looked like about 35. And you know how I have this kind of square jaw. He had a square jaw like me, the same eyes and kind of sandy blonde hair. And I was like, oh, my grandfather, but he's young. And he could speak through telepathy. And he was just full of absolute joy, love, freedom. And I felt at home with him, and I felt loved. He was always a safe, wonderful human being who wanted to know me before he died. He died when I was 10. Well, I decided at that point, since God had said, be like a little child, I shrunk my soul into this childlike soul. And my grandfather kind of communicated, it had hurt me that he gave my father this beautiful 1960s Chevy truck or Ford truck. I don't know which one, but it was a beautiful old truck, and it just rusted in our yard, and he never did anything with it. Well, there it was in heaven. It was brand new and beautiful. And he was like, I'll drive, you get in the back. And so I jumped in the back like I had done as a kid. And we were traveling through these fields, and I was just happy. And I remember the great peace and the happiness. And then he turned back and he said, hey, Tricia, you want to go on? And I knew he meant go on to God. And I also knew that he understood. He was getting messages that my surgery was having some complications and that maybe I wasn't going to make it after all. And so, it was time for me to go to God. So I just went for it. I was like, well, who doesn't want to meet God? And I went flying towards God. And I felt people's prayers, like my mom's prayers. One aunt had lost her daughter in her 20s, and I heard her very clearly saying, oh God, don't let Tricia die. I don't want her mom to go through what I went through of losing a daughter. It's too hard. It's too hard. I heard every word that people said. I heard every emotion that they said. And I even heard the people who were praying just kind of because they felt like they should. They didn't have a lot of emotion behind it, and it was funny to me. I could tell who loved me. My grandmother loved me. My mom and dad were terrified. As I went towards the light, though, I started to realize, oh, I'm feeling really good. Like this is nothing I've ever felt before. And I felt amazing. We never feel completely good in our bodies. We always feel a little pain or anxiousness, or something's just not right. As I was in that presence of God, everything felt right. I felt completely loved. I felt completely fine, exactly as I am. I didn't have to try. I didn't have to do anything other than be loved and be love. And so that love was like, I call it an atomic bomb of love, because it really just erased everything that was fear, everything that was pain, everything that I didn't want to take with me. And I realized what God had said earlier of love is all that you take with you. I was like, oh yeah, I don't even remember, my mom's abuse or, any of that. I'm love. And I was like, oh, I never want to go back to that. Let's stay here. This is good. This is what I've been looking for my whole life. No, not going back. And as soon as I said that, bam, there was like a wall that I hit. And I was like, uh-oh. And I heard this booming voice that said, look down. And, when you hear the voice of God, you can't deny it. It's not a voice that's male or female. I say it just kind of vibrated through me. It just shook me. And so I looked down and I saw this beautiful river. And along the river, there were souls that either had a shadow around them or they were open and they were connected to the light. And someone once asked me, well, how many souls were connected to the light and how many were in shadows? And I was like, oh, well, more were in shadows. But I was like, but it's not all that, it doesn't mean that people are bad. It means that they might be depressed or worried or sad or grieving. There's all kind of reasons why they may not be in connection with God. It's not always criminality. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's just disbelief. But you don't have to be religious to be connected to the light either. I saw even some atheists were connected to the light because they were really excited about their careers. They were excited, to be good people, to live, to enjoy life, to be kind, like they were connected to a light. And spirituality certainly can connect us to that energy of God. But basically, my message was, okay, you're going to go back and you're going to remind people that they're either operating in fear or they're operating in love and openness to God, but not just all people. You're going to go back and you're going to teach. And at that moment, I was like, teach? Oh, no, no. And it's so funny that my ego returned at that point, because then I suddenly remembered that I didn't want a traditional job. I wanted to be a lawyer before this. I wanted to be powerful. I wanted to be rich. And I was like, no, I'm not going back to that world without power. And God was like, just laughing at me as I argued. And I just felt this humor. And I also felt this kind of knowing, that it would all make sense in time. And I felt like my soul was bunched up and kind of thrown back into my body, but with great humor. And, we get the kind of near death experience that makes sense to us. And my dad was a clown. and humor is important to me. And just so the fact that God was humorous with me, it was a personal relationship. And so when I woke up from surgery, I remembered everything. I am not one of those people who had to go back and recount any of it. Like, I woke up in that operating room and I was like, as they were handing me ice chips, I couldn't tell the difference between me and the rest of the room. I felt like I had, my energy was too much. It took up the whole room. And as they were saying, "What's your name?" I was like, "Her name? I have to go back to her?" Like I was arguing with them about, like, I felt separate from myself. And then I had to say, "Oh, my name is Tricia." And I remember the sadness. I was like, oh, I have to return to this broken body. I have to return to this life, and I might have to learn to walk again. And this mom that I have to stay with. And I just remember, the deep sadness. But then, as soon as I thought about the angels and I thought about that experience, this great joy erupted in my soul. And I was like, you know what? I have a mission. And that mission is going to mean everything. And I've touched eternity. So it doesn't matter that I'm not going to be rich. It doesn't matter that I'm going to go teach school. I have a connection to that other side. I have a connection that is going to last my whole life. And I knew that, and I was talking to nurses and doctors. My surgeon came in. I was like, "How long was I dead?" And she was like, "Whoa, we thought we lost you for a couple of minutes, but you're fine now." And she kind of gave me this look like, "Do I have to medicate you?" And I was like, very intuitive. As soon as I came out of surgery, not an intuitive bone in my body, like in college. Maybe as a kid, it was somewhat intuitive, but I mean, my intuition was like, I could read people, and I was like, okay, shut up. You don't want her to medicate you. You want to get through this, and she doesn't want to talk about this. But I couldn't help it. I was overflowing with joy, and I would talk to nurses and different people. I was like, "Do you believe in God? Because God is this great big ball of energy and love." And they were like, "Okay." A lot of people were kind of amused by my descriptions, but I was, medicated and on morphine. I was in the hospital for 9 days, the ICU for 3 days. Feeling returned to my leg. My surgeon was very happy about my physical recovery. I just kept talking about the afterlife, almost an obsession. And my grandmother brought me a notebook, and I started writing what the angels look like, and what they meant to me. And she was Catholic, and so she was kind of curious about the angels. The first thing my mother asked was, "Did you see Jesus?" And I was like, "Well, I heard something that was reminiscent of Jesus, but no, I saw light." And then she was like, "Okay, well, then it wasn't of the light." And I was like, "Ooh, okay, can't talk to her about this." And so, I was just making a mental note of who I could talk to, who I couldn't talk to. And luckily, one of my neighbors was spiritual, and I barely knew her, but she snuck in, and she was one of the first friends there. And she grabbed my hand. I told her the whole story, and we became just like instant friends. And she was like, "I believe you." She was like, "But by the way, you look terrible." And no one had shown me. And she showed me a mirror, and like, oh, I'd been in the hospital 9 days. My hair was greasy, my face was puffy. Oh, I looked a mess. And I remember kind of crying because more friends were coming the next day, and this nurse who was off duty took the time to wash my hair. And I remember thinking, this is holy. This is a holy moment where someone is being kind to me, and I just want to extend this kindness for the rest of my life to people who are suffering and people who are hurting. That is the best thing we can ever do with our lives. And so I have had that opportunity with a lot of students. I've taught junior high, high school, and now at a community college. And I can honestly say that God did understand me, because teaching was far more for me than it was for the students. I know it has helped some students, and I know the light has worked through me. But I would say that every bit of my, all the people who weren't there for me, I got to be there for people in those situations and to be an advocate for abused kids and to put them on a healing path. And most of all, just to listen to students and help them see their connection and believe in themselves. And, it's been a great life because of teaching, like that and fast forward, I there were times in life where I wondered, why does teaching go so well, and then when my ego takes over, the rest of my life doesn't go so well. And then it kind of hit me. I was like, oh, you're of service and you're in the light when you're teaching. And so I learned that lesson that everyone's mission is just to stay in the light and to stay in service and to be of service in any way that you can to people, because that is when God works through you.
Love it. That was a fabulous story. You had almost all the elements that near-death experience can have. I'll open it up for questions. But your book is entitled "Angels in the OR or ER OR."
Oh, are you? Yeah.
And any other comments on? Did you see them working through the surgeons? Any
Yeah,
more description of
they
the energy work or?
they do, and I've been lucky enough to interview some surgeons many years later who do feel and work with angels. But my surgeon actually died a few years later, and she was young when she operated on me. She died in a head-on collision herself,
Wow.
and so yeah, the kind of sad, but I hear her over there sometimes. I think she's cheering me on in a way. She has a different experience with all of that. But yeah, I wrote the book only, I started writing in 2016 because people, like, I didn't tell my story at all until the local chapter at IANS in Dallas wanted to hear my story. And I say publicly, I actually told it to every group of students, like every group of students. And I think public schools would have been horrified, but it was like, story time, or I'm an English teacher. So, I would have students write about their lives and I'd tell them the most important story of my life as an example. And they always wanted to tell me about ghost stories and hearing their grandfather in the afterlife, or we'd have, it was magical. But I didn't think that I would ever publicly tell the story, but Jen Holden got me to tell it on I Survived Beyond and Back, and then National Geographic interviewed me, and oh, it was horrible. Like, that's why I wrote the book. They had a picture of me, and then they had this one line: the light told Tricia to go back and be a teacher. And she believes that the light works through her. And I was like, oh, that's terrible.
Huh.
So I decided to tell my story in my own way. And, when you're young and you have a near death experience, it's different than when you're older. When you're middle aged and you have an experience, like if I had one now, I'd have to integrate that into my career and my life, and I'd be more stable. As a young person, I was single. How do you date after a near death experience? How do you interact with people who are just interested in going out, and drinking at clubs, and you're suddenly doing yoga and hanging out with, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s. And like that, there was a lot of change I went through. And there was also, I felt it was important that people who are empathic and very open, I was definitely taken advantage of by people. Like sociopaths target people who are, really open and full of the light. And I had to learn how to protect myself through time. So there was a lot, there's a lot to the story. The book is maybe not for everyone, but I wrote it in a way that if all you want is the near death experience, the first 5 chapters are the experience and learning to walk. The rest of the book is really some trauma and this world, and how I learned to heal from trauma at deeper levels, and how to help students heal from trauma, and how to how to really incorporate and how to deal with the hard things of this world, but also remain connected to God.
Hmm. Julie.
Hey, hi Tricia, thank you. A couple things. Was it do you teach in public school? And when you started talking to your students, did you get any pushback from the adults, teachers or parents or, because they're not always as open?
Yeah, so I live in Texas and it's a very, conservative state. And when I taught at low income schools, nobody cared. Like, I mean, no one's looking at it. So when you're teaching very poor kids, you can say and do whatever you want. And, you're just giving motivation. I taught one year though at a more wealthy school in the country, and it wasn't my story that got people. I had a group of students who were emotionally challenged, and I was like, hey, let's teach them to meditate. And this is long before meditation was in school. This was like in the early 2000s. And so I taught my students to meditate. They could finally concentrate and read. I mean, and so the honors students wanted to learn to meditate. Everyone wanted to learn to meditate because at first they saw it as getting out of work. Oh my God, I was such a renegade that the superintendent, the principal called me in, and they were saying, and parents started writing letters, like, yeah, you're teaching Buddhism to my daughter. And I'm like, she can talk to Jesus. I'm just teaching meditation, like it's like silence, and like I had a stack of Bibles this high on my desk. Like, parents were mad. And the superintendent, listened to what I did, and he was like, oh, it's really not that big of a deal. He said, I see that it has benefits, and I don't think it's strange what you're doing, but please don't do it anymore because I want to watch the football games. So so I figured, the pay's so low, what are they gonna do, fire me? Oh, big deal.
Thank you.
Helen. Let's see. I can help unmute you.
Oh,
or-
there.
There you go.
Sorry. Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this. When you talk about once you were consciousness after you'd left your body and you saw your grandfather and he was young and you saw the old car and you were out in the field, was that more of an astral time, or what kind of body were you in to get in a car if you had expanded so much? Did you just go back to form, or?
The whole time I kind of kept something that looks like a spirit body, like a body made of light. So the angels were kind of made of light. And that's how my body kind of felt the whole time. Even when I blended with the oneness, it's like my consciousness understood what everyone else thought and felt, but I still also retained my individuality. So, there was that. And even as I was moving towards God, that was the only time I felt like, okay, I'm beginning to merge with God and I'm beginning to forget me, just for a split second, but I still felt like me as I was moving towards God. The only thing that I did different in that realm with him was kind of shrink my body. So I was like 21 and then I became like 5.
Hmm.
Interesting.
And
Thank you.
you can do all of this with consciousness. So I think that's why, I knew he could go back to earlier ages and look different. So I knew I could too. So you kind of learn quickly just by observing what others do over there. And I think it's Eben Alexander who writes about it's important to think about what you want to do in the afterlife. Like, what is it you want to experience? How do you want to send energy to people that you love? What do you want to play around with consciousness?
But
Okay.
you actually changed your appearance when you were having this experience. I've not heard that before. Your
Yeah,
age.
yeah, because I saw that my grandfather did it, so I realized, well, I can too.
Cool. Other questions?
I just have a question about whether you're still in Texas. It's just hard to imagine for me.
Oh, it's hard to imagine for me too, but I'm part of the TRS teacher retirement system, and I have 4 more years in the system, and then I'm in Portugal or Spain or somewhere else in the world. It won't be enough just to leave Texas. I've got to get, I gotta travel, man.
Yeah.
But you know, if I was somewhere else like California and I fit in so well in California, I guess I wouldn't make as much of a difference. You know, these students are, you know, people assume I teach at a majority minority community college. So my students are very open-minded and, you know, not to get political, but not a single one of my students voted for Trump. You know, out of 200 students, they are horrified and angry. And, you know, young people here are not happy in Texas. So, I mean, like, I'm just kind of helping students cry and, you know, process things and you know, really kind of deal with life. And most of all, they're just having trouble surviving financially. You know, like rent is so skyrocketing in my area. So a lot of what I'm doing is helping people connect with real estate agents and look at starting different communities, regenerative farms and little areas where, you know, one family might buy a plot, they might put container homes there, you know, just different communities allowing for more affordable living in this area. So I try to get involved with my students in the community and really make life easier for other people and them and kind of cut through some of the politics. But yeah, a lot of my students, their parents are here illegally, but you know, they're not criminals, they're just mowing lawns. And my students are amazing people. And some of my students are, you know, drag queens, but they're amazing students. And some of my students are conservative, you know, and they're kind of horrified, you know, by some of my other students, but it's good for them, you know, to blend with other people and get to know other people. And, you know, I try to make my classroom a place where everyone is a community and people can drop their judgment and we can kind of move forward and love one another. And luckily, I have had quite a few conservative students tell me, you know, all I've ever heard is Fox News in my life, and you're the first person I've ever met who's different and I like you. And I'm like, well, good, remember that.
Encouragement.
Truly an inspiration.
So
How do you,
Tricia, I have a
if you feel,
question.
okay,
So you mentioned that you still have some of the physical effects from your accident several years ago. Have you tried to work on yourself energetically to heal, and how did that work?
Oh yeah. So I have done a lot. And I think, you know, at some point it's just maintenance because I have a lot of metal in my body. So back in the 90s, they put you know, those big rods that hook on above and below. I broke several vertebrae. And so it just, you know, there's going to be a certain amount of maintenance with NUCA chiropractics and energy work and things that I do. But by the end of the day, you know, I'm in pain a lot of times, but I work with it. I do yoga, I walk, I do everything I can to help. And you know, I do feel, and this is what I hear from the angels, that there will be lots of breakthroughs medically, and especially around pain and light therapy and seeing the body differently and kind of like this blending of energy work and light therapy. You know, that there is, you know, there are new modalities always coming online for pain management. And so yeah.
Good. And David, do you have a question? David Simison?
I do. Tricia, I have the sense that you feel connected to the light still, and I'm wondering how it is you maintain your connections with the light.
You know, it's really interesting. It never goes away completely. So even when I've been depressed, even when I've been angry, even when I've gone through horrific things, sometimes it becomes very small, it's far away and I'm angry and I'm mad, but it just, I think once that door of perception has been opened, it can never be fully closed. And, how I maintain it is I go out to nature and I ground, but I've always gone out to nature. I've just sat on the grass and just talk to God, talk to my ancestors, talk to my angels. I'd like to lucid dream. So one way to lucid dream is to turn off technology before bed. You don't look at it for 10 minutes or 30 minutes before bed and really center yourself and your consciousness and just keep telling yourself, even if it takes a month or 2 months or a year, I'm going to lucid dream. I'm going to, have these experiences. And I think, I joke that near-death experiencers were a little loosened from our body, like in realistic terms, it's just a little easier for us, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible for others to have those lucid dreams and to have those experiences. So when you're in pain, that's a great time to reach out to God. And usually those healing messages are very, very simple. It's that people who are in pain, the angels see them like children, God sees them like children, that if we looked at other people's anger and pain as just children throwing a fit, we'd forgive a lot more people.
Virginia. You're muted.
Let me unmute. Okay, there you go. I missed the beginning of your talk, Trish, but I was wondering whether or not, how did you know they were angels? You may have answered this already and I missed that.
Well, I didn't, because they didn't look like anything I'd seen in paintings or, as a kid, I'd read the Bible many times and they looked like light beings. They were massive. They were huge. So they were like 7 feet tall. But I knew that they were messengers of God. That was a term that I feel that they gave me. And so I knew that they were bringing me a message that I would be fine. And I knew that they were made of light. They were just far more intelligent than I realized. And they communicated with telepathy. And the whole way that they looked, I mean, I didn't see wings, but they had this like energy behind them, almost like, they were wearing not really robes, but like an energy of light. And so I see why people think it's wings, like who knows, maybe they are, but mostly they were composed of light. And, honestly, I've played around with AI trying to get close to that image and I've gotten as close as I can get, but they have hair like about my length, but thicker and not really male or female, but their eyes are pure light. And, like they're more light beings is a more accurate term, I think, than angels because they are literally made of light.
So how are they different from God from that experience?
God was all knowing, all loving. They seemed to have an individual form that was not human. It was more intelligent than human and more massive, than human. But it was not like when I was near God, it was like, oh, this is my creator. I have been created. I am a part of this creator. I am a part of this love. And even words defy it, really. God was just, I mean, the best description is an atomic bomb of love, just, to me, just being melded into more love than you can imagine, because that is what would heal us all, when you think about it.
Thank you.
That was good. David Sobers.
Great talk, Tricia. I've got 4 points, probably overwhelming a bit. First, well, I'll give them all to you, and then you could take them in the order that you want. One is, did you talk to the surgeon and relate to them some of the events that occurred during surgery that would, shall we say, impress them? Number 2, you had talked about being an attorney. Did you become an attorney and a teacher both? So think in your head, no attorney. Um, did have you married and do you have children? And are you raising, I trust if you do, you're raising them differently than you were raised?
So no, part of my story at 15, my dad was a Vietnam vet and he was dealing with a lot of PTSD. He was a great guy in many ways. I love my dad, but there's some alcoholism and mental illness, and my mother was extremely mentally ill. So at 15, I was like, I don't know what they have, but I'm not passing on this generational trauma. This stops right here. And so at 15, I made a pact that I was not going to have kids, that I was going to heal myself in this lifetime and overcome this generational trauma. And that didn't change. The near-death experience did not tell me to go back and have kids. It told me to teach, and to help kids, but not necessarily to have them. My family, being the religious family that it is, that's the first thing they asked the surgeon. They were like, oh my God, is she going to be able to have kids? And the surgeon was like, well, she'll probably be on bed rest for 8 months if she did, because I'm really fused. I can't gain weight, or I start, I'm already, 5 pounds over where I should be. But I remember thinking, oh, this is a good excuse not to have kids. That who wants to be on bed rest for 8 months? Not me. I have a life to live. So yeah, no kids. And I was an odd 20-year-old. I was really honestly hanging out with a lot of hippies, like in meditation groups and a lot of older people, right after my near-death experience, and not dating any of them, but just kind of hanging out, meditating. And some people felt like parents, and I kind of needed that extra parenting. I did, have one boyfriend throughout college, but he was traditional and he had a great mom and dad and he wanted to have kids. And so there was this part of me that I was like, as much as I loved him and as great as he was, and don't you think I've kicked myself a million times? He designed video games. He became a multimillionaire, like within a couple of years after college. And he's a great guy. He's a wonderful guy. But it just wasn't my path. And I wanted him to have kids and I wanted him to have the life that he wanted. And so we broke up. And, from that point forward, I didn't really think that romance, if you're not going to have kids, it's not the top of your list. So career and spirituality have always been important. Not that relationships haven't. I've tried, I've married and divorced more than once, but there's this part of me that's so free that when it just doesn't work, I'm just like, there's no use for you to be unhappy or me to be unhappy, go live your life. And I'm happy. And so I think that level of happiness is kind of shocking to people, especially, men, just I'm fine on my own, just always have been. And I don't think that's necessarily an NDE thing, but I will tell you with endings, I don't see them that way. I'm just like, oh, I'll see you on the other side. It'll be fine. We'll forgive each other. It's okay. I'm not into some kind of free love lifestyle, but I'm just not into holding on to grudges. I tried, it didn't work. So, and as far as the surgeon goes, I did ask her, she didn't want to comment on it too much. And I pushed her and I was like, so how long was I dead? And she looked it up and she told me I was dead for 2.5 minutes. So 2 minutes and 34 seconds. And that was about all the verification I could get for her. When I was interviewed with I Survived Beyond and Back, they got my medical records and they saw that what was written down, why I died, was all the internal injuries. I had bled to death on the operating table. And so they were spending time cauterizing veins and dealing with the amount of blood that I had lost, which kind of coincides with, I couldn't believe how much blood was on the operating table. There was just all this blood on the sheets. And so that was the cause of death.
Yeah. Did you have a fourth question, David?
I did. So when you have had these engagements with the other side, did you let me back up. Some people think that we have multiple lives and our consciousness cycles through various people and personalities through life on this planet and perhaps others. Did you have any insight into the multiple life aspect or on the other side?
Oh, that's a great question. I didn't during the near-death experience, but since you live on the East Coast, you might find this amusing. I briefly taught in Boston, and I lived on the East Coast for a year. After my near-death experience, I remember dying in the 1920s in Boston. And I was an older woman who my husband had died many years before me and left me kind of a nice house. And I had not been into academics, but I read all his books. And so that's why I came into this life with such a thirst for English and poetry and writing and knowledge. Because I read all of the books in his library, and he had a lot of wealth, and I didn't have kids in that lifetime either. And so I was giving away all his money to different artists and different people, but I could walk through Boston, and anything built before the 1920s, I could find it. I knew, Cambridge very well. I knew that area very well. And throughout my life, I've remembered so many snippets. I remember what that husband was like. I remember my whole life, that entire lifetime, just it's all come back to me. So I definitely remember like being in touch with spiritual people too in the 20s. I think there was a spiritual movement, and I wanted to come back. Like I wanted to remember it, so there's a connection. And there's a great past life regressionist out of England named Kevin Wooding. I interviewed him on my channel. If you ever want a past life regression, I've had about 5 from him. Oh my God, it has shifted so much in my life. So I do believe that, there are certain individuals that we have karma with. Now I just, I just see it, that there are certain situations that can be resolved with a past life regression. Certainly our souls hold on to certain memories for sure, without a doubt. I mean, yeah, we've done this before. I do remember as a kid, like knowing more than I should. Like I remember looking at my mom and thinking, damn, she doesn't know much. What's wrong with her? Like there was this sense of being an old soul and she was kind of a young soul. Yeah, I mean, in silly ways, but how could I know, certain things at really young ages? But I just, sometimes there's just a knowing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
David, this is Nancy Carter. I'm not showing up on video. Can you hear me?
Yes, then I can
Oh.
see you.
Oh, you can. Okay, I don't see me here, so hi.
Hi.
I was curious about your comment about your light in this world attracting negative beings. You said sociopaths. And what was it that those people would want from you, and how did you learn to protect yourself?
So, on a basic level, I came back with so much love. So if you see someone on the street handing all their money to people and, hugging people, someone who's targeting people is going to see, oh, that person's really giving. They're going to give me, the time of day. Even, if that, so I had a really bizarre stalker for 20 years, who, yeah, I mean, he's a high level criminal, who just wants to terrify me. And I think, he basically is angry at me because I didn't want him, so, there are those types of situations where people, are really attracted to your light or your love, and, I joked like I would hug a serial killer or, a crazy stalker. I think I did hug him at a poetry reading, just because I was super loving. And now I just don't hug people that way, like I have these boundaries, because of that. And that's kind of sad. But, I don't hug students. I really, have a lot of physical boundaries. But, I feel like you can you can love people with words, you can, encourage them. And I just got better at reading people. Sometimes people don't like to talk about negative energies, but I came back to Austin and, finished up college. There's a lot of drugs and alcohol in that area. I didn't have an interest in doing that, but I would still go to parties where people were drinking and doing drugs. And I would sometimes tell my NDE story. Most of the time, people were just open and happy to hear it. But this one time, this young man like heard part of it, and it was like he was lifted up out of his body and thrown against a wall. He couldn't get away from me quick enough. And I was like, wow, there's some kind of attachment that he has. Maybe he was doing a hard drug, and maybe, that experience did not coincide with what I was saying. So I felt like I could begin to see ghosts and negative attachments to certain people. And I believed I could just clear them, So I think my faith and my openness, I'd walk into a lot of situations that were dangerous, and I would make a good, difference, in certain ways. But the stalker was a weird one. And I think if anything, it's just taught me that our light is meant for those who can see us. The ones who only see their own egos, that's not who our light is meant for.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
I have a question.
I was hoping you would, Brooke.
Tricia, first, I forgot that I had heard your story before. Once you started talking about the pickup truck and your grandfather, I've definitely heard your story before. It actually helped me dig out of a really tough pit of anxiety. Your story was one of them. So it's good that you're sharing this. Like, it definitely helps people. So are you still, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think about still, like, when your like earthly physical body finally does pass for good, like if you would miss any of this human life that you're living right now, or does it just like when you cross over, does it just stay? Like, you don't miss it because there's nothing to miss. It's still there. You're still you.
I know what you're saying. I do. I understand your question. And I was so attached to this body before the near-death experience. I'm less attached to it. Like, I love my dog. I worry about, if something happened to me, no one could take care of this dog as well as me. So, there's little things, but I know that the minute you transition, everything's fine. So I know that it's natural. Like, we go through a little bit of animal panic at death. If you choke, you're panicked. If you're in pain, you're in pain. There's a natural fear of death in the body, but as soon as the spirit looks at it, it's fine. Like, as soon as you enter that realm, you just don't see it the same way. You're just in a different realm because you're learning so much, and you're able to let go of this really quickly. So I would say, while in body, it's kind of impossible to imagine it, but as soon as you get out, it's cool.
Okay. And well, no, that's awesome. I figured you'd say something like that. Also, I've recently, for some reason, I've been like put on this little, just search, like kind of dialogue with myself, that I've heard some things about, like, what is your feel on perhaps during meditation, or like certain mediums or something, if you seek a certain person to help you with something, the possibility of, and I think evil is a strong word, but I like that sort of a spiritual thing being let in if you're not prepared or something? Or is there certain, like, do you feel like with your experience, like God knew you were prepared to be able to handle it and to be able to filter that and to be able to help people and not let that in, or come through you to people? Or is it like,
Yes.
I don't know if that's
No,
I'm like rambling.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. And I had to learn along the way. So I think there's someone who says, bigger angels, bigger devils. And that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense to me, because I had a lot of faith and a lot of confidence and a lot of faith in God, so I felt like I could blow through most situations and not an ounce of fear would come up. So I was protected because I didn't have fear. The minute I hit something like the stalker that I didn't understand, like a level of darkness that was, scared me a little, then I became more like a scared human being running around. And then it was attached to me, that attachment. So, if you can have no fear and you can live with no fear and total connection to the light, then there's nothing that can touch you. But I think most of us are a little afraid. So I always tell people, if you see a ghost or you sense that entity, immediately call on something stronger, call on Jesus, call on God, call on anything, that you believe in, that is of the light, because that will help that entity cross over. And if you have trouble, I've removed entities from people who have gone into ayahuasca sessions with shamans who didn't protect the circle, and they've got this entity talking to them the whole time. I mean, it's kind of intense, and I've spent like a whole hour fighting with this entity, and eventually it will release. Sometimes some things seem a little more intense, but I do know it's possible to clear everything, and I do know it's possible to walk in the light and not get these attachments, and that the more you focus on love and light as a strength and as a protector, the more you are protected from. But so here's my one little shocker. When I started talking in the spiritual community, people are like, oh, go see John of God, go talk to him. And I was like, I'm not going to Brazil. I don't have the money for that one. But so I called in and I got the protocol through the mail. And I felt a spirit come to me, and I asked it. I said, well, you're unusual. Who are you? And I said, can you heal me? And it said no. And I said, oh, get them out of here. Get away from me. I don't want you. If you can't heal me, I don't understand why you're here. And then months later, all that information about John of God being into human trafficking and doing all these horrible things, raping women at his casa, came out, and I was like, oh. So you can ask spirits directly if they're good, or if they're there to give you a message. I think a lot of times people get afraid and they don't think to ask it. What are you here for? Why are you here? Do you need help transitioning? And in that case, I realized that he had like these spirits that would partially heal you, but then they would take some of your energy as well. And so I was like, no. So I think it's important to talk to spirits, figure out who they are, because they can't lie in that realm, and to always call on the light.
Thank you.
Yeah, good advice.
Long answer, but I hope it helped.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Santa.
And did they say anything about you having planned this in your life plan ahead of time?
That's something I've interviewed a lot of people and talked with a lot of people about, and it makes sense. I've actually had quite a few astrologers do my report in retrospect, and they found that childhood came up at that very day, accident came up, that they were in, spirituality came up. So a lot of things connected all at once. And I did have to go back to my mom's house for 9 months and recover in a body cast, and kind of redo some things and realize that I was an adult, and understand her from a different point of view. She's still a difficult human being, so that kind of came up in my chart. But what I've found is that our lessons can be easier and easier the more we're on our path. And so, that same thing came up on my chart like a week ago, and I was like, am I going to die? Am I going to have another accident? But what it was that I just watched a movie about a mom and her daughter, and this mom was very loving, and I just cried through the whole movie, just like imagining what it would be like to have a mom that loved me. And I just kind of let that wound heal a little bit more. And so what I realized is, like, I had to have an accident then. This time I just had to do some emotional healing. And so I think we can always pray for easier lessons and pray that we're further along our path to where, we just do some gentle healing.
Wow. I have one question. It feels like there's a lot of low vibration, dark energy that's being pushed to the surface today in this country and in the world, like nothing I've ever imagined or witnessed. And I'm curious. It appears like it may be there as opportunities being presented to all of us to choose love in a much more difficult situation. But I'm wondering if you've picked up anything or have any insights on what's happening and that subject.
This is what I tell my fellow professors. Those meerkats that sense danger and they're just up on the hill. I feel like if you're intuitive or you're everyone senses, oh, something weird is happening. Like, I think everyone is just a little nervous, and it's because there's big changes happening. There's something massive happening worldwide, and we don't quite know how to take it all in, what to do. But certainly, the thing that I always return to is community, love, working together, and this really does kind of play out even in the worst of scenarios. If you love your neighbors, they'll help you out. If you stockpile a bunch of weapons, they might kill you for your weapons. Like we need to be a community. We need to love one another. We need to learn how to work together. We need to learn how to move forward together in unity. And that can be challenging, but that's what we're trying to break through to. And it might be that we have to, if I'm going to look at it philosophically, that we have to separate into tribes that we understand for a while and work within those units, and then eventually, become one. But I don't know how it all works out. I just know that I'm like that meerkat, and not to make people afraid. I'm just saying, there's a lot of weird energy going on. That's all I can pinpoint, is that it's a little scary.
Shift. Well, thank you. We're at the 8:30 mark. This has been fabulous. Does anyone have any more questions for Trish while we have her? Oh, good questions tonight. And man,
Can I ask a simple one?
Please.
I hope it's simple. So you describe your experience. It sounds chronological to me. When you say you were in the room, then I can't remember all of it, but then you like see your grandfather in the truck. Was it like that, or was it just like? Was part of it chronological and then it was just like all at once, but this is how you can describe it and it's the only way you can describe it?
That's a really good question. Certain moments blended together. So I'd say as soon as I left the hospital, everything happened at once before I saw my grandfather. That was like a really, kind of intense moment. Like, it was almost a blending of oneness and the life review. And it's like, it was just out in space. It slowed down. I felt like he was worried that I might not make it. Like, the surgery was a little dicey, and he was kind of going, is she staying here? Is she going back? he was trying to determine how to interact with me, to keep me there in heaven, for some time with him, or to send me on, and so I think it was kind of interesting, that moment. And he's appeared to me. So, when you say chronological, it's like it's ongoing. It's like a book that's always open. He shows up at different times, and has things to say. And I think our ancestors do, sometimes they plant little ideas, or they just send us a little bit of love, or they're hoping for something good to happen, or they want us to remember them and create a little bit of heaven on earth by remembering them. So I'd say he's still in my life, that's still ongoing, and God is still in my life. So what we love, we have here and we have forever. And that's the main message that I want people to always remember, is what you love, you never lose. Even though you may lose in physical form, you don't lose in that form.
That's great. Good way to end it. Thank you so much, Tricia. This has been a special one. Really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you everyone for your kindness and your questions. It has been fun, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
Tricia, you have a
Thank you
channel that people could go to, it sounds like?
Oh, a what?
A channel?
Oh yeah. You want me to it's if you just type in Healed by the Light Tricia Barker on YouTube. I've interviewed a lot of different NDEers. Some really my latest ones, they haven't been interviewed by too many people. So there's some new stories on there, some new NDEers who've never told it before. I kind of like helping them, like tell their stories for the first time. And then there's some people who've told their stories a lot. I read Howard Storm's book and interviewed him. He was one of the first people. I thought it was kind of interesting, since he was an atheist and I was agnostic, and it's been fun. But yeah, Healed by the Light. And then my website is triciabarkernde.com.
Okay.
Okay.
Wonderful.
All right.
Keep up the great work. Thank you. And group, we do have a
Thank
speaker for
you.
next month. So
Thanks,
with that,
David.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.